Hi everyone, welcome to the I Am Knower channel. This time, I will tell you a story about Alexander the Great, son of fire and empire. For that, let's take a few moments to detach from the hustle and bustle of the outside world and turn inward. If you like this video, please push like button and subscribe this channel. Forward, there is nothing impossible to him who will try. Alexander the Great story is filled with kings, emperors, and conquerors, but only a few step outside the shadow of time to become legends. Alexander III of Macedon, known to the world as Alexander the Great, did more than build an empire. He shaped the imagination of humanity for over 2,000 years. This book is not just a chronicle of battles and borders. It is the story of a man who burned with vision, who saw beyond the edges of the map, challenged the limits of culture and identity, and dared to believe he was born for something more. In just over a decade, Alexander created one of the largest empires in history, blending East and West and leaving behind not only cities, but ideas of unity, leadership, and ambition. His legacy is not just in what he conquered, but in how he refused to accept what was possible. This is not a book of praise or condemnation. It is a story, a journey from boy to warrior, from man to myth. Let it begin. Chapter 1, the boy from Pella. Long before he was crowned a conqueror of nations, before his name echoed across deserts and mountain passes, Alexander was simply a boy, one born not just into royalty, but into destiny. It was 356 BCE, in the ancient city of Pella, capital of Macedon, that Alexander entered the world. His birth was said to coincide with the burning of the temple of Artemis at Ephesus and Omen. Some said that a god had descended to earth. To others, it was the birth of a storm. Alexander's father, King Philip II, was a master strategist and brutal reformer. He had transformed Macedon from a fractured backwater into a military powerhouse. He was a lion of a man, ambitious, cunning, and as feared by his enemies as he was respected by his allies. But for all his power, Philip was not the only force shaping young Alexander. His mother, Olympias, was no ordinary queen. A devout follower of the cult of Dionysus, she was passionate, shrewd, and fiercely devoted to her son. She whispered to him stories of divine lineage, claiming that Zeus himself was his true father. Whether Alexander believed this or not, it left a mark. He would spend his life walking the thin line between man and God. From a young age, Alexander was unlike other boys. His tutors noted his unyielding curiosity, his fiery temper, and a hunger to understand the world beyond the palace gates. When other boys played with wooden swords, Alexander demanded lessons in strategy, philosophy, and poetry. By the time he was 10, he could recite Homer's Iliad from memory, and not just recite it, but analyze it, debate it, live it. Recognizing his brilliance, Philip sought a teacher worthy of his son. The answer came in the form of a man who would shape the very soul of the boy king, Aristotle. The philosopher was brought to Mieza, where Alexander and a small group of noble youths, the companions, were educated in a grove of trees under the open sky. There, Aristotle taught him more than logic and science. He fed Alexander's mind with ideas of virtue, reason, and the ideal state. But more than anything, he taught him that the world was knowable and perhaps conquerable. But it wasn't all scrolls and speeches. At 12, Alexander tamed the untamable stallion Bucephalus, a black horse feared by all. While others gave up, Alexander noticed that the beast was afraid of its shadow, turning the horse toward the sun so it could no longer see it. He mounted it and rode as though he had always belonged in the saddle. Philip was said to have wept that day and told his son, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedon is too small for you." It was not just a father's pride, it was a prophecy. By the time Alexander was a teenager, he had already led troops into battle, acted as regent during his father's campaigns, and began to understand the delicate dance of diplomacy and domination. He watched his father expand Macedon's borders with steel and fire, and he learned. But he also watched Philip's court unravel in whispers of betrayal, new wives, and the brewing jealousy of a son denied his rightful place. The road to empire was not straight, and it would not be given. If Alexander wanted the world, He would have to take it. And when the moment came, he would not hesitate. Chapter 2. The Rise of the Warrior King. By the time Alexander turned 18, the world around him had grown both vast and volatile. King Philip II's conquests had brought Macedon to the brink of dominance over Greece, but his court was a boiling cauldron of rivalry, suspicion, and ambition, and at its center stood the young prince, watching and waiting. Tensions between Alexander and his father had been growing. Philip had taken a new wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, a young Macedonian noblewoman who bore him another potential heir. At the wedding banquet, one of Philip's generals drunkenly toasted to a legitimate successor, implying that Alexander, the half-epirote son of Olympias, was not. Insulted and furious, Alexander reportedly threw a goblet at the man and exchanged words with his father, who drew his sword on his son. It was a scene out of Greek tragedy. A king, sword in hand, too drunk to stand, facing a prince with the fire of gods in his veins. Alexander fled the court with his mother and spent months in voluntary exile in Epirus, then Illyria. But Philip, always the political tactician, eventually called his son back. Macedon needed unity. War was brewing. In 338 BCE, Alexander proved himself not just as a prince, but as a commander. At the Battle of Charonia, Philip led the Macedonian army against the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. It was a defining moment in Greek history and Alexander's first taste of true warfare. Philip placed him on the left wing, commanding the elite cavalry. Facing the famous sacred band of Thebes, a unit of fiercely bonded warriors, Alexander charged with relentless precision. His cavalry shattered the Theban flank. The Athenian alliance collapsed. It was said that Philip wept with pride as he embraced his bloodied son on the battlefield. Macedon now ruled all of Greece, united through force under the newly established League of Corinth. Philip was named hegemon, or supreme leader, and he set his sights eastward to Persia, the ancient enemy and the greatest prize of all. But destiny had its own design. In 336 BCE, at the height of his power, Philip was assassinated. It happened during the wedding of Alexander's sister, Cleopatra, to the king of Epirus. As Philip walked through the theater in Aegae, unguarded and basking in glory, Pausanias, one of his bodyguards, stabbed him to death. The motives were murky: revenge, jealousy, conspiracy. Some whispered that Olympias was involved. Others suspected Alexander himself. But there was no time for rumors. Power abhors a vacuum, and Macedon was full of hungry men. Within days, Alexander moved with ruthless speed. He eliminated rivals, secured the loyalty of the army, and was proclaimed king of Macedon at the age of 20. The young king now wore the crown of a kingdom built by his father's wars, but he intended to forge an empire of his own. His first act was to stamp out rebellion. Greek city-states, believing the boy king would be weak, began to stir. Thebes, ever the defiant city, rose in revolt. Alexander marched south with such terrifying speed that the rebellion ended before it had begun. But he would make an example. In 335 BCE, Thebes was razed to the ground. Its walls were torn down, its citizens sold into slavery. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. The message was clear: Macedon's rule would not be questioned. The world had underestimated Alexander. Now, with Greece quiet and his enemies either dead or kneeling, he turned to the east to Persia, the vast and ancient empire of Darius III, rich in gold, soldiers, and history. And with him, Alexander took not just an army, but an unshakable vision that he would not just defeat an empire, he would reshape the world. Chapter 3. Into Asia. The first strike against Persia. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander stood at the edge of the Hellespont, the narrow strip of sea dividing Europe from Asia. It was more than a physical boundary, it was a symbolic crossing from the world of his ancestors into the realm of the unknown. Before he crossed, Alexander made his sacrifice at Troy, paying homage to the heroes of the Iliad: Achilles, Hector, and the gods who once warred in myth upon those same plains. He offered his shield at the tomb of Achilles, whom he claimed as a spiritual ancestor. As he stood over the ruins, perhaps he saw not stones and dust, but destiny calling. with approximately 35,000 soldiers, including Macedonian phalanxes, Greek, hoplites, archers, and cavalry. Alexander crossed into Asia Minor. He had little gold, no navy to speak of, and was outnumbered by the Persian Empire many times over. But what he had was belief in himself and from his men. The Persian satraps in Asia underestimated the young invader. They assembled a force near the Granicus River, aiming to repel him before he could dig in. The Battle of the Granicus. The Battle of the Granicus River was Alexander's first major engagement against Persian forces, and a showcase of his daring. Persian commanders expected the Macedonians to wait until morning to cross the river, but Alexander did the opposite. He attacked immediately, leading the charge himself. Charging through the swift waters of the Granicus, Alexander's companion cavalry smashed into the Persian front lines. Arrows flew and scimitars clashed against bronze shields. At one point, Alexander's helmet was split open by a Persian nobleman, Spithridates, who raised his axe for the killing blow, only to be cut down by Cletus the Black, one of Alexander's oldest guards. The victory was total. The Persian satraps were either slain or fled, and the road into Asia Minor lay open. Alexander did not simply take cities, he liberated them, or so he said. In Ionian cities like Sardis, Ephesus, and Miletus, he presented himself as a Greek avenger, freeing the descendants of Hellenic settlers from Persian rule. He even restored democracies in some cities, winning over the people as much by policy as by force. But Alexander's campaign was not only a military conquest, it was a performance of power. Wherever he went, he sent messages back to Greece, coins minted with his image, and letters to the temples confirming his dedication to the gods. He moved not just as a general but as a king, building a legend. Siege of Halicarnassus. Not all cities fell easily. The fortified city of Halicarnassus, held by a Persian commander named Memnon of Rhodes, resisted fiercely. Alexander laid siege for weeks, battering the walls and repelling sorties with relentless pressure. Eventually, the defenders set fire to their own city and fled by sea. Alexander took the ruins and moved on. By the end of 330 for BCE, most of Western Asia Minor was under Macedonian control. But this was just the beginning. Deeper in Persia lay vast armies, endless riches, and a king named Darius III, who was beginning to understand the scale of the threat. Alexander would go to meet him, but he would not go as a mere general. He would go as a force of history. Chapter 4, The King and the Storm, the Battle of Issus. By 333 BCE, the march into Persia had become more than a campaign, it was a phenomenon. Alexander's victories across Asia Minor had sent shockwaves through the ancient world. Cities surrendered at his approach, while others prepared for brutal sieges. But even as he pushed deeper into enemy territory, the shadow of the great king loomed. Darius III, ruler of the Persian Empire, had finally grasped that Alexander was no mere raider. He was an existential threat, gathering a vast army from the corners of his realm. Bactria, Babylon, Egypt, and beyond. Darius prepared to confront the Macedonian king personally. The two forces met near the coastal plain of Issus, a narrow stretch of land between the mountains and the sea. It was not the battlefield Darius had intended. His massive army, possibly numbering over 100,000, was squeezed into a bottleneck. Alexander's smaller but disciplined force of around 40,000 now had the upper hand. The Battle of Issus, clash of kings. Rain had soaked the ground the night before. Alexander's army, tired from marching south through Cilicia, was cold, hungry, and dangerously close to being cut off. Darius had circled north, hoping to trap him. But Alexander, as always, turned pressure into opportunity. On the morning of the battle, he formed his lines, the Macedonian phalanx at the center, Greek mercenaries to either side, and companion cavalry on the right, his personal hammer. When the attack came, it was swift and precise. Alexander led his cavalry in a thunderous charge, personally smashing through the Persian left. The phalanx surged forward, pinning Darius's forces against the Panaris River. Darius, surrounded by his elite guards and nobles, soon found the front, collapsing as Alexander pushed forward, cutting a path toward the Persian king. Darius panicked. His chariot turned and fled the battlefield. It was a catastrophic blow to Persian morale. The moment their king vanished, the rest of the army followed. Thousands were slaughtered or captured in the chaos. Among the captives was something unexpected. Darius's own family, his wife, mother, and daughters. Mercy and message. Alexander treated the royal women with honor, a move that shocked even his enemies. They were kept safe, well-fed, and treated with dignity. When the queen mother mistakenly bowed to Alexander's general Hephaestion, thinking he was the king, Alexander gently corrected her. "You were not mistaken, mother. He too is Alexander." It was not just kindness, it was propaganda. Word of his magnanimity spread, painting him not only as a warrior, but as a noble and just ruler. In the months following Issus, Darius sent letters offering ransom, peace, and alliance. He promised gold, territory, even his daughter in marriage. Alexander rejected all of it. "I am now the king of Asia," he replied. "Come and bow or fight again." And so the pursuit continued. Alexander turned south to secure the coast, determined to break Persian naval power by capturing their port cities. He would soon arrive at a place that refused to kneel, the island fortress of Tyre. And there, the storm would rise again. Chapter 5. The Siege of Tyre, war against stone and sea. After Issus, the Persian Empire reeled. But Alexander knew that to truly conquer it, he needed more than victories on land. He needed to control the sea. Persia's navy still dominated the eastern Mediterranean, supplied and supported by key port cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Gaza. Most cities submitted, but Tyre, the jewel of the Phoenician coast, refused. Built partly on the mainland and mostly on an island fortress half a mile offshore, Tyre was a marvel of ancient defense, protected by massive walls rising over 150 feet from the sea, and by a powerful fleet. Its leaders offered a compromise. Alexander could sacrifice in their temple of Melkart, but they would not allow Macedonian troops inside their city. That was not enough. Alexander declared he would take Tyre no matter the cost. The impossible causeway, Tyre's very location, made it nearly invincible. A full assault required ships, and Alexander had few, so he rewrote the rules of siege warfare. He ordered his men to begin constructing a causeway, a massive land bridge of rock and timber stretching from the mainland to the island. It was a feat of engineering never before attempted. Day after day, his soldiers, engineers, and laborers dragged stones into the sea. As the causeway neared the island, Tyrian forces struck back, sending fire, ships to burn the works, launching raids, and showering the builders with arrows. The sea became a battleground. Alexander responded by calling in fleets from conquered ports Sidon, Byblos, Rhodes, and blockaded the city by water. He turned the tide not just with brute force, but relentless creativity. He built massive siege towers directly on the causeway, equipped with catapults and protective hides. He dredged the sea floor to prevent enemy divers from sabotaging his foundation. He had divers plant chains to trap enemy ships. It took 7 brutal months. The fall of Tyre. By July of 330 to BCE, the causeway reached the city's edge, with ships surrounding Tyre and siege towers pounding the sea walls. Alexander ordered the final assault. His men breached the southern wall. Chaos erupted inside the city. Alexander's troops stormed in with vengeance. The siege had cost hundreds of lives, and he would make an example. Thousands of Tyrians were slaughtered. Over 30,000 were sold into slavery. Only a few were spared, including those who had sought sanctuary in temples. Alexander himself led a ritual sacrifice at the temple of Melkart, fulfilling his promise as conqueror, not guest. The message to the rest of the eastern Mediterranean was clear: no city, no wall, no sea could stop him. From there, he marched south, taking Gaza after another stubborn siege. Then he entered Egypt, where he was welcomed not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. There, among the sands and sun gods, Alexander would find something even more lasting than conquest: immortality and legend. Chapter 6. Pharaoh of Egypt, the founding of Alexandria, and the oracle of Zeus-Ammon in 330 to BCE. Fresh from the bloodied victory at Tyre and the fall of Gaza, Alexander marched into Egypt, the ancient kingdom of the Nile. long under Persian rule. But unlike other cities that had resisted, Egypt welcomed him with open arms. The Persian satrap fled before his arrival. The priests and people, weary of Persian overlords, greeted Alexander not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, and soon, after, as something more. He was crowned Pharaoh, the living god-king of the two lands, crowned by the Nile. In Egyptian tradition, the Pharaoh was not merely a ruler, he was a bridge between the divine and the mortal. By accepting the title, Alexander wasn't just claiming political control, he was stepping into sacred myth. He offered sacrifices to the gods of Egypt and took part in native rituals, further legitimizing his rule. Though Macedonian by birth and Greek by culture, Alexander's genius lay in his ability to adapt, to absorb the cultures he conquered instead of destroying them. He would be Greek in Greece, Persian in Persia, Egyptian in Egypt, a chameleon of empire. But Alexander was not content with ancient cities alone. He wanted to leave his own mark on the world. The birth of Alexandria. Along the northern coast, near the mouth of the Nile Delta, Alexander found a narrow strip of land between the sea and Lake Mareotis. It was a place of trade, wind, and sunlight, and he saw its potential instantly. Here, he ordered the foundation of a new city, Alexandria. Designed by the Greek architect Dinocrates, the city would become one of the greatest cultural and economic centers of the ancient world. It would host the famed Library of Alexandria, the lighthouse of pharaohs, and serve as a melting pot of Greek, Egyptian, and Eastern traditions. Alexander never lived there, but his vision did. It was his gift to history, and one of the many cities that would bear his name, the Oracle of the Desert. And yet, Egypt held more than glory and honor. It held a mystery. Driven by a desire for divine confirmation, Alexander set out across the harsh western desert to visit the Oracle of Zeus Ammon at the Siwa oasis, an isolated temple. Deep within the sands, the journey was perilous. Blistering sun, shifting dunes, and a waterless trail tested his army. Legend says that ravens guided his path, and a miraculous rainstorm saved his men from dying of thirst. Alexander believed it was the gods themselves protecting him. At Siwa, the priests received him with awe. They addressed him not as king but as son of Zeus Ammon. What exactly they told him remains a mystery. Alexander never revealed the oracle's words, but from that moment on, his belief in his divine origin was unshakable. He was not just king, he was destined, chosen by the gods to rule the world. In Egypt, Alexander became more than a general. He became a myth, a living legend bound to prophecy, blending the lines between history and divinity. But his true challenge lay ahead. Darius III still ruled the East and the Persian heart and remained unconquered. And so, with Egypt under his banner, Alexander turned his gaze once more toward Asia and toward Gaugamela, the battlefield that would decide the fate of an empire. Chapter 7, the Battle of Gaugamela, empire on the edge of a sword in the heart of Mesopotamia. Near the village of Gaugamela, two titanic forces prepared to collide. The date was October 1st, 331 BCE, a day that would decide the fate of two empires. On one side stood Darius III, King of Kings, commanding perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 troops, Persian cavalry, infantry, war chariots with scythe blades on their wheels, and even war elephants. He had chosen the field carefully, a wide, flat plain, perfect for his massive army to maneuver and envelop. On the other side was Alexander, with around 47,000 soldiers, outnumbered at least 5 to 1. Facing an enemy defending its homeland, Alexander was betting everything on his strategy, his soldiers' loyalty, and his own brilliance. Preparations for war. Darius had learned from Issus. He prepared the terrain, flattening it to favor his cavalry and chariots. His men waited behind barricades, ready to crush the invaders. Alexander, arriving days before the battle, scouted the land himself. He assembled his army in phalanx formation, flanked by elite companion cavalry, and stretched his forces wide, matching the Persian line in breadth. And then, before dawn, he prayed to the gods and mounted Bucephalus, his loyal warhorse. He knew he would not be fighting a battle, he would be claiming an empire. The battle begins. At sunrise, Alexander advanced slowly, drawing Darius's forces forward. Then, with precision honed from years of campaigning, he executed his signature move, a rightward slant, pulling the Persian left away from its center. Darius, nervous that Alexander would outflank him, committed his cavalry to intercept. It worked, but it also opened a gap in the center of the Persian line. That was what Alexander had been waiting for. He wheeled his companion cavalry and charged through the opening. Like a lightning strike, his phalanx surged behind him. The Macedonians crashed into the Persian heart, driving toward Darius's royal guard. Darius, watching his center buckle and fearing encirclement, once again fled the field, his chariot bouncing wildly as he escaped. Into the east, without their king, the Persian army collapsed into chaos. Macedonians slaughtered the disorganized ranks. It was a crushing, almost miraculous victory. Alexander had done the impossible. He had destroyed a superior force through tactics, patience, and nerve. The King of Kings. After the battle, Alexander entered the great cities of Mesopotamia, Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire. That each city surrendered without a fight. In Babylon, he was greeted as a divine ruler. In Susa, he found enormous treasures, gold, silver, and royal archives. And in Persepolis, the seat of Achaemenid grandeur, he claimed the palace of Xerxes the Great. There, in a moment both symbolic and controversial, Alexander burned the royal palace, possibly as revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens 150 years earlier. Or perhaps, as some say, it was a drunken impulse sparked by his companions. Either way, the fire lit more than a building. It marked the end of Persia as a sovereign empire and the birth of Alexander as king of Asia. But even in triumph, Alexander's quest was not over. Darius still lived, and beyond Persia lay new frontiers, new legends, and new obsessions. Chapter 8, The Hunt for Darius, Death of a King, Rise of a God. Though Persepolis burned and the Persian throne had fallen, Darius III was still alive. And for Alexander, that was unacceptable. Victory would not be complete until the King of Kings was dead or in chains. Darius had fled east into the rugged lands of Media and Bactria, hoping to raise a new army from loyal satraps and tribal allies. But his empire had fractured. Many governors no longer served the king, they served themselves. The relentless pursuit. Alexander gave chase across barren plains, snow-covered mountain passes, and scorching deserts. He pursued Darius not just to end a war, but to claim legitimacy. He wanted to be more than the man who conquered Persia. He wanted to be its true heir. In the spring of 330 BCE, Alexander learned that Darius had been betrayed by his own general, Bessus, the satrap of Bactria. Hoping to claim the throne himself, Bessus had arrested Darius, calling himself Artaxerxes V, and rallying eastern forces under his name. But Darius was no longer useful to Bessus alive. When Alexander's forces closed in near the town of Hecatompolis, Bessus and his conspirators stabbed Darius and left him to die in a wagon. Alexander arrived shortly after, too late to save him. Death of the great king. They found Darius mortally wounded, bleeding out under the stars. According to legend, Alexander approached the dying monarch and offered him water. Darius, with his final breath, allegedly thanked him and named him his true successor. Whether that story was true or invented, Alexander used it well. He buried Darius with full royal honors in Persepolis, wore the robes of the Persian kings, and took the title of Shahanshah, King of Kings. Bessus, now a usurper, became the new target of Alexander's campaign. But Darius's death marked more than the end of a war. It marked a transformation in Alexander himself. He was no longer the Greek avenger of Troy, nor the Macedonian conqueror of cities. He had become something larger, a fusion of East and West, of man and myth, the empire reforged. Now wearing a Persian dress, surrounded by eunuchs and scribes speaking Persian and Greek, Alexander began to rule as a Persian king and at shop many of his own men. He adopted court customs, demanded proskynesis, ritual bowing, and married the idea not just the land of Asia. To the Greeks and Macedonians, it was foreign. Even Parmenion, his seasoned general, grew uneasy. But Alexander had outgrown their approval. he was not returning home. Instead, he marched deeper into the unknown, into Bactria, Sogdia, and beyond the edges of every known map. His next target, Bessus, the king-slayer turned pretender, and behind Bessus lay the farthest reaches of the Persian world and the edge of India. Chapter 9, Into the Wild East, Bactria, Roxana, and the Fall of Bessus. Beyond the heartland of Persia lay Bactria and Sogdia, lands of high mountains, wine-scoured plains, and fiercely independent tribes. Here, the empire was more idea than infrastructure. Persian governors held power by tribal allegiance and fear, not by city walls or coins. And it was here that Bessus, the betrayer of Darius, fled to make his final stand. But Alexander would not allow the empire to splinter. The Long War in the East, from 330 to 328 BCE, Alexander waged an exhausting guerrilla war across Central Asia. It was unlike any campaign he had ever faced: ambushes, rebellions, harsh winters, and terrain that swallowed entire armies. Bessus declared himself king under the name Artaxerxes V, hoping to rally Persian loyalty. But few trusted him after the murder of Darius. Alexander, relentless as ever, pursued him deep into Bactria. When Bessus's own allies turned on him, he was captured and delivered to Alexander. The fate of the usurper was gruesome. In Persian custom, Alexander had him publicly mutilated, his nose and ears cut off before executing him. A clear message: no traitor would wear a crown, a queen from the mountains. But war was not all that Alexander found in Bactria, in the fortress of Sogdian Rock, where rebels had taken shelter high on a sheer cliff. Alexander performed one of his most daring feats. When the defenders mocked him, claiming he would need men with wings to take the fortress, Alexander replied, "Then I shall find men with wings." Under cover of night, he sent a team of elite climbers up the cliffs. At dawn, the stunned defenders saw Macedonian soldiers above them, silent and deadly. The fortress surrendered without a fight. Among the captured was Roxana, the daughter of a local noble. She was said to be beautiful, proud, and fiercely intelligent. Alexander, captivated, took her not as a concubine but as a wife. Their marriage was a political move, designed to bind the eastern territories to his new empire. But it was also personal. Roxana would be the only woman he has ever recorded to have truly loved. For many Macedonians, it was another sign that Alexander was no longer their king but an eastern ruler. Wearing robes and wedding foreigners, he was changing rebellion within. While Alexander was forging a new world in the east, not all his companions approved. Tensions rose. His old general Parmenion, loyal and experienced, was accused of plotting against him through his son Philotas. Whether guilty or not, both were executed, a shocking purge of longtime allies. From this point forward, Alexander trusted fewer men. He became harsher, more unpredictable, and more divine in his own eyes. He began to demand proskynesis, that even Greeks bow to him as a living god. He wore Persian dress, kept a court of eunuchs and astrologers, and drifted from his old Macedonian identity, that he was no longer Alexander of Pella. He was king of Asia, Shah of Shahs, and soon he would believe himself a god. With Bactria pacified and Sogdia under siege, Alexander looked east again. Beyond the Hindu Kush mountains lay the unknown lands of India, whispered of in Greek myths as the edge of the world. There, new kings ruled, new armies waited, and new legends would be born. Chapter 10, The Edge of the World, India, and the Battle of the Hydaspes. Beyond the towering Hindu Kush, Alexander entered a land that even the Greeks only knew from myth. India, rich, wild, and ruled by kings with strange customs and unimaginable armies. It was 326 BCE. Alexander's men had marched thousands of miles from Macedon, crossed deserts, rivers, and mountains. They had defeated the greatest empire in the world. But now they faced something different. This was not Persia. This was the unknown, a new world. As the Macedonian army descended into the lush Indus Valley, they found cities unlike any they had seen, built with different gods, languages, and weapons. The people painted their bodies, worshipped sacred rivers, and rode into battle on beasts the Macedonians had never encountered before. War elephants. In the region of Punjab, Alexander encountered a king who refused to submit. Porus, a ruler of towering stature and fierce pride, who commanded a large, disciplined army and over 200 war elephants. Porus prepared to face Alexander at the Hydaspes River, modern-day Jhelum River, in what would become one of the most grueling and legendary battles of Alexander's life, the Battle of the Hydaspes. The Hydaspes were swollen with monsoon rains. Porus took up a defensive position on the far bank, confident that the deep, swift river would prevent Alexander from attacking. But Alexander was a master of the unexpected. He marched his troops upstream, under cover of night, quietly crossing the river with boats and rafts. By dawn, his army was already forming up on the far side, catching Porus off guard. The battle that followed was brutal. Porus unleashed his war elephants, who charged into the Macedonian lines, trampling men and shattering formations. The noise, the chaos, and the sheer psychological terror of the elephants nearly broke the Macedonian phalanx. But Alexander countered with discipline and precision. His cavalry harassed the flanks of the elephants. His archers aimed at the mahouts, elephant drivers. As the elephants went mad with pain, they began turning on their own men. After hours of savage fighting, Porus's army was shattered. His sons were killed. His elephants collapsed in heaps of blood and dust. And yet, Porus himself refused to yield. Wounded and surrounded, he stood tall on the battlefield until Alexander ordered his men to stop. He approached the defiant king and asked, "How would you like to be treated?" Porus replied, "Like a king." Alexander, impressed by his valor, spared him and returned his kingdom with honor, even expanding his rule. It was a gesture that combined generosity with strategy. By making Porus an ally, Alexander secured his eastern border without another siege. But the cost of the victory was steep. Rebellion in the ranks. The Hydaspes was not just a physical river, it was a psychological breaking point. Alexander's army, battle-hardened but exhausted, looked east toward the Ganges River, where rumors spoke of even larger kingdoms and even more elephants. Faced with the idea of yet another impossible campaign, the soldiers finally did what no army had dared do before. They refused to march forward. At the Hyphasis River, modern Bees, Alexander stood before his army and pleaded. He spoke of destiny, of glory, of immortality. But the men had had enough. The great king, the unstoppable conqueror, wept not from defeat, but from frustration. Still, he relented. The army would turn back. Chapter 11, The Long Road Home, the Judrasian Desert, and the Cracks in the Empire. Turning back from the banks of the Hyphasis River in 326 BCE, Alexander's dream of conquering all of India came to an end, not with a battle, but with a decision. His army had reached its limit. The men who had followed him for nearly a decade across 17,000 miles of terrain finally said, "No more," and so began the return march. But rather than take the safe route back through the mountains or along the rivers, Alexander chose a deadly path through the Judrasian Desert, modern-day southern Iran and Pakistan. Historians still debate his motives. Was it a test of endurance, a punishment for his army's refusal to go farther, or a symbolic echo of past legends, like Cyrus the Great, who had once failed to cross the same wasteland? Whatever the reason, it became one of the deadliest decisions of his reign. The desert march, the Judrasian Desert, was merciless. Blistering sun by day, freezing winds by night, sandstorms, and near total lack of water or food supplies. Alexander divided his army into columns, marching along the coast while sending ships with supplies, but the ships were delayed by storms and reefs. The result was a catastrophe. Men collapsed from thirst. Horses died in droves. Even noble officers were reduced to crawling. It's said that when a helmet of water was brought to Alexander, he poured it into the sand, refusing to drink when his men could not. But heroism could not overcome nature. By the time the army emerged from the desert weeks later, tens of thousands were dead. It was the greatest loss of life in Alexander's entire campaign, and it came without a single battle. Restoring order after the desert, Alexander rejoined his governors and satraps across Persia. What he found infuriated him. While he had been campaigning in India, many of his officials had grown corrupt, abusing local populations, stealing tribute, and building personal fiefdoms. Even some of his most trusted men had betrayed the integrity of his empire. Alexander responded with a ruthless purge. Dozens of satraps and officials were executed. Others were stripped of command. He replaced them with new governors, often choosing Persians and locals over Macedonians. Another sign of how far he had moved from his roots. This only deepened the rift between Alexander and many of his veteran officers who saw themselves as conquerors, not administrators of a blended empire. The mass wedding at Susa. In an effort to unify his diverse empire, Alexander staged one of the most extravagant political gestures in history. The mass wedding at Susa. In a lavish ceremony, he and 80 of his senior officers married Persian noble women. Alexander himself took to new wives Statera, the daughter of Darius III, and Parysatis, daughter of Artaxerxes III. It was a public symbol of fusion. Greece and Persia, united by blood and vow. But many Macedonians saw it as betrayal. They had not come east to wear silk robes and bow before eunuchs. They came to conquer. And now, they were being asked to become Persians. Cleitus the Black. Tensions came to a head in a drunken banquet. Cleitus the Black, one of Alexander's oldest companions, the man who had once saved his life at the Battle of the Granicus, spoke out. He criticized Alexander's Eastern ways, his adoption of divine titles, and the growing disdain he showed for his own people. In a fit of rage, Alexander grabbed a spear and killed Cleitus with his own hand. Silence fell. The man who had crossed continents, who had wept before the Ganges, now knelt in grief over the body of a friend. He had become both legend and tragedy, fused into one. Now, with his empire stretched from the Nile to the Indus, with rebellion simmering beneath gold and silk, Alexander prepared for his final campaign, a return to Babylon, and a plan to move farther west. But fate had one more act to play. Chapter 12, Babylon, Death of a God, Birth of a Legend. In 323 BCE, Alexander the Great returned to Babylon, the city at the center of his empire. He was 32 years old. He had never lost a battle. He ruled more territory than any man in history before him. But Alexander was no longer the eager prince of Pella. He had become a figure, half man, half myth, a king, a god, a visionary, and to some, a tyrant. He dreamed not of rest, but of new conquests, Arabia, Carthage, even Rome. In Babylon, he began drawing plans for a global capital, issuing orders for fleet construction, mapping expeditions to Arabia, and organizing a new military campaign that would stretch beyond the known world. But the gods, or perhaps time itself, had other plans. The illness. In late May or early June, during preparations for his Arabian campaign, Alexander fell suddenly ill. The symptoms came swiftly: fever, chills, weakness. At first, he shrugged it off, but after several days, he could no longer stand. Some accounts say he became paralyzed, unable to speak. For nearly 2 weeks, he lay in agony, drifting in and out of consciousness. Panic spread through the city. His generals, Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Seleucus, and others waited anxiously outside his chamber. The people begged for his appearance. As his condition worsened, Alexander was carried to the palace courtyard, where his soldiers passed by one, silently looking into his eyes. It was said that he acknowledged each of them with a nod, though he could no longer speak. Then, on June 10, 323 BCE, Alexander died. The world stood still. Theories of his death, like his life, remains shrouded in mystery. Ancient sources suggest everything from malaria, typhoid fever, or West Nile virus, to alcohol poisoning or even assassination by his own men. Some believed it was divine punishment. Others whispered it was revenge for his growing megalomania. Whatever the cause, the effect was immediate and chaotic. An empire without heir. Alexander left no clear successor. On his deathbed, when asked who should rule after him, he is said to have whispered, "To the strongest." With those words, a war for control of his empire erupted. His generals, later called the Diadochi, would fight for decades, tearing the empire apart and founding their own kingdoms. Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucus in the east, Antigonus and Cassander in Macedon, and Greece, boy King Alexander IV. his posthumous son with Roxana, would be a puppet and eventually a casualty of politics, the immortal legacy. But Alexander's story did not end with his death. His body, preserved in honey, was taken not to Macedon, but to Egypt, where Ptolemy entombed him in Alexandria. His tomb became a pilgrimage site for centuries until it vanished from history. His legend, however, only grew. In Egypt, he was worshipped as a pharaoh. In Persia, he was remembered as a liberator and a destroyer. In the East, he was immortalized in epic tales like the Alexander romance, blending fact and fable. To some, he was a military genius. To others, a divine agent of fate. To all, he was a man who reshaped the world in just 13 years, from the Mediterranean to the Indus, from Zeus to Ammon, from Pella to Babylon. Alexander left no land untouched, no culture unchanged. He was not just a conqueror, he was a mirror of ambition itself. Epilogue, the echo of empire. Alexander died at the height of his power, in the heart of the empire he forged, before he could see it fractured and claimed by those who once followed him. In death, as in life, he remained the center of the storm, the sun around which generals, kings, and legends would orbit for generations. But perhaps his greatest legacy was not political or military. It was cultural. The world after Alexander was never the same. His campaigns created the Hellenistic age, a time when Greek ideas, art, science, and language merged with the traditions of Egypt, Persia, and India. Philosophers debated in Babylon. Greek became the language of trade and diplomacy from the Nile to the Indus. Even centuries later, Roman emperors would trace their glory back to him. He was gone, but never forgotten. His body disappeared. His tomb was lost. His empire crumbled. But his name endured, etched into maps, whispered in courts, and written into the DNA of every conqueror who came after. Napoleon studied him. Caesar wept at his feet. And to this day, the name Alexander carries with it the weight of greatness. He did not live to see old age. He did not need to. He became eternal.